He was the most powerful man in the world. He captured kings, humbled popes, and reshaped the politics of Europe. His empire stretched from Spain to the Americas. When Emperor Charles V heard that his aunt Catherine of Aragon had been humiliated, abandoned, and cast aside by Henry VIII, that her daughter Mary had been declared illegitimate, Europe believed war might follow. If anyone could punish Henry, it was him. But when the moment came, he did something far colder. He chose peace. No rage, no revenge, no fleet sailing for England. So why did the most powerful ruler in Christendom watch as his own aunt was stripped of her crown, her title, and her dignity? Was it indifference? Or was Charles V carrying a burden so heavy that even family had to bow before the demands of empire? This is not Catherine's story. This is the story of the emperor who could move the world, but would not move for his own aunt.
Welcome back to History Untold. I'm Alex, and together we'll uncover the hidden secrets of the past.
If these untold stories speak to you, hit the like button and join our family. Let's step into the past together. Chapter 1. The boy who inherited everything and was ready for none of it. Here is something most people never think about. Charles V, the man who would one day rule more of the world than any European since Julius Caesar, was not raised to be an emperor. He was not even raised to be a king. He was born on the 24th of February, 1500, in the city of Ghent, in what is now Belgium, a flat, foggy Flemish city of merchants and cloth traders and canals. His first language was French. His second was Flemish. He grew up eating Flemish food, watching Flemish festivals, surrounded by Flemish advisors who treated him like their own. Nobody looked at this pale, quiet baby with his long face and jutting jaw, that famous Habsburg jaw so pronounced it made eating difficult, and thought, there goes the future master of the world. But fate does not ask permission. His father was Philip the Handsome, charming, reckless, dead at 28. His mother was Joanna of Castile, brilliant, broken, locked away in a Spanish tower before Charles was old enough to understand why. And here is where this story first connects to Catherine of Aragon. Joanna was Catherine's older sister. They were daughters of the same parents, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, the most formidable royal couple of the age, the monarchs who completed the Reconquista, who funded Columbus, who turned Spain into the most powerful kingdom on earth. That made Catherine Charles's aunt, his mother's sister, the same blood, the same family, the same proud Spanish line. And here is something that matters. Catherine was family in the way the 16th century understood family, a political asset, a moral obligation, and a human being, all at once. To fail her was not just a personal failing, it was a statement about what kind of man, what kind of emperor you were. As a boy in the Burgundian court, Charles knew who Catherine was, the Spanish princess sent to England as a bride for Prince Arthur, widowed within months, left stranded for years in a foreign country while her father and her father-in-law haggled over her dowry as if she were a piece of furniture nobody wanted to pay for. He knew her, he wrote to her, and years later, when her marriage began to collapse, he would place his most trusted man at the English court specifically to defend her. But before Charles could protect anyone, he had to survive his own beginning, because fate had a brutal sense of timing. One by one, the people standing between Charles and power began to die. His uncle, Prince John of Spain, died of fever in 1497. His aunt, Isabella of Portugal, died in childbirth in 1498. Her infant son, Miguel, died before his second birthday in 1500, the same year Charles was born. Every funeral added a crown to a boy who was still learning to walk. By 1516, when Charles was just 16 years old, his grandfather, Ferdinand of Aragon, died, and Spain fell into his hands. He arrived on Spanish shores surrounded by Flemish advisors. Many Spaniards viewed him with suspicion. To them, he was not a national king, but a foreign heir who had simply inherited their country. Then 3 years later, in 1519, his other grandfather, the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, also died, and the empire came for him too. The election that followed was not a ceremony, it was a bidding war. Charles's chief rival was the dazzling King Francis I of France, who spent a fortune trying to buy the 7 prince-electors. Charles spent even more. His campaign was financed by the powerful Fugger banking family of Augsburg, who effectively bankrolled his rise in exchange for imperial favor. The cost was staggering, around 850,000 gold florins. More than half came directly from the Fugger Bank. On the 28th of June, 1519, the result came back unanimous. Charles, aged 19, was now Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, Lord of the Netherlands, Archduke of Austria, Lord of a rapidly expanding empire in the Americas, and now the temporal head of all Christendom. He had not asked for any of it, and not one of those titles came without a war attached to it.
Chapter 2. The Emperor Who Never Had a Quiet Year. Let us be honest about something. When people ask why Charles V did not sail to England and rescue Catherine of Aragon, they are imagining a man sitting on a throne with armies at his feet and nothing else to do. That man did not exist. And to understand why, you need to understand something about the world Charles inherited. Charles didn't inherit peace. He inherited fires, burning in different places for different reasons. And from the age of 19, he was running between them. Spain, 1520. He has been king for 4 years. He cannot speak Spanish properly. He has handed the best government positions to his Flemish friends, men his Spanish subjects had never met, could barely understand, and resented deeply. The Spanish cities have had enough. They rise, not peasants with pitchforks, city councilors, merchants, minor nobles, educated men who feel their country has been inherited by a foreign boy who sees Spain as a prize, not a home. They call themselves the comuneros, the commoners fighting for their community. And they do something that stops Charles cold. They march to the castle of Tordesillas, where his own mother, Joanna, is being held, and kneel before her. They tell her she is the real queen, that her son has stolen her throne. All she has to do is sign one document. Joanna listened to every word, and then she said no. Day after day they returned. Day after day she refused. This woman, dismissed by history as Joanna the Mad, locked away for years, looked the rebellion in the eye and chose her son over her own freedom. By the way, if you want to understand just how tragic Joanna's story really was, how the men around her, even the ones she loved most, failed her, I've covered that in another video about Joanna of Castile. The link is in the description. Whether Joanna's decision was love, clarity, or the careful calculation of a woman who had seen enough of power and betrayal, we cannot say. But her refusal broke the rebellion. Without her signature, the comuneros were just rebels. The noble armies crushed them at Villar in April 1521. Their leaders were beheaded the following morning.
When Charles returned to Spain in 1522, he was not the boy who had left. He had learned Castilian. He dismissed the Flemish advisors his people despised. He appointed Spaniards to the highest offices. And then he did something that would echo, quietly, painfully, all the way to Catherine's life. He needed money, desperately. His wars had swallowed everything the Fugger Bank had lent him and demanded more. So in 1526, he broke his betrothal to Mary Tudor, Catherine's daughter,
The girl Catherine had worked years to make the future empress. He married Isabella of Portugal instead. Isabella brought a dowry of nearly 1,000,000 ducats. It paid his armies. Catherine received the news from across the water. Think about what that moment meant. Mary's betrothal to Charles had been Catherine's masterwork, her great diplomatic achievement, the proof that despite everything, she still mattered, that her blood, her connections, her 20 years of loyalty to England still carried weight in the courts of Europe. He married Isabella of Portugal in March 1526. The Spanish streets celebrated. Charles's throne was secure. He had understood at last that to rule Spain, he had to become Spanish. But what about Catherine? Catherine was in her English palace, watching. And what she was watching was her husband's eye beginning to drift toward another woman, Anne Boleyn. This was not a coincidence of timing. This was the same year, the same moment. Henry VIII looked at his wife and saw something he had perhaps never seen so clearly before. A woman whose own family didn't value her. If the most powerful ruler in Christendom, her own nephew, could discard her daughter for a better offer, what exactly was Catherine worth? What leverage did she have? What protection? Henry had his answer, and he began pursuing Anne Boleyn seriously, passionately, with the confidence of a man who had just watched the last door close behind his wife. When Charles chose empire over family, he didn't just wound Catherine, he handed Henry the knife. Charles thought his throne was secured. He had no idea what was coming next. In 1525, at the Battle of Pavia, everything changed. Charles V crushed his greatest rival, Francis I of France. In the chaos of battle, Francis was thrown from his horse, dragged into the mud, and captured. The news reached Charles. He walked into his room alone and thanked God. He refused to celebrate. He said it wasn't right to rejoice over the fall of another Christian king. Then he sent Francis to a tower in Madrid and laid out his terms. Give up your claims to Italy. Surrender the Duchy of Burgundy. Leave your 2 young sons here in Spain as hostages until every promise is kept. Francis agreed. He swore on the Gospels. The moment he crossed back into France, he broke every word of it. He claimed an oath made under pressure meant nothing. Francis didn't just walk away. He turned the whole of Europe against Charles. He built a new alliance, not just with Italian states, but with Suleiman the Magnificent, and even worse, with Pope Clement VII, the very man Charles was sworn to defend, now his enemy. Pause for a second, because this is where it gets heavy. Charles is just 26. In 6 short years, he's crushed a rebellion in Spain, watched a religious revolution tear through his empire, defeated and captured the King of France, and now faces a coalition that includes his deadliest rival, the most powerful ruler outside Christendom, and the head of his own church. All at the same time. And somewhere across the water, in an English palace, his Aunt Catherine is about to need his help. He is going to try. But first, his army in Italy is about to do something completely out of his control, something so catastrophic that it will change his relationship with Rome, with Henry VIII, and with Catherine's fate forever. Chapter 3. Rome burns, and a door opens for Catherine. In 1527, Charles's army in northern Italy was huge and battle-ready, but unpaid for months. It had Spanish soldiers, Italian troops, and about 12,000 German mercenaries called Landsknechts. Many of them were devout Lutherans who believed the Pope was the Antichrist. They were hungry, they were angry, and there was no commander alive with enough authority to hold them back. On May 6, 1527, they reached Rome, and what followed was not war. It was pure brutality. The sack of Rome lasted more than a month.
churches stripped bare, the Vatican ransacked, nuns violated, priests murdered in the street. Pope Clement VII fled through a hidden corridor, the Passetto di Borgo, a secret passage built into the city walls, and watched Rome burn from the ramparts of Castel Sant'Angelo. Charles, in his palace in Valladolid, put his court into mourning when the news arrived. He was genuinely horrified. The desecration of the holiest city in Christendom wounded him as a man of faith. And then, and history tends to lower its voice here, he kept Clement a political prisoner until the Pope agreed to his terms. Every demand met, a massive ransom paid. Charles was a man of sincere faith and a man of cold political intelligence. Both things were true at once. The horror was real. The leverage was real. He used them both. Now, here is exactly why this matters for Catherine. That same year, 1527, Henry VIII began quietly pursuing an annulment of his marriage. His argument, the original papal dispensation allowing him to marry his dead brother's widow, had been invalid from the start. If the Pope agreed, Catherine's 20-year marriage simply never legally existed. Mary was illegitimate. Catherine's entire life was declared a fiction. And the one man in the world who could grant that annulment was sitting in Charles's political grip. Pope Clement could not grant Henry's request. He was not free to act. Charles made absolutely certain of that, through diplomatic pressure, through his ambassadors, through sustained, documented, deliberate interference in the papal process. For 6 years, Henry's annulment went nowhere. 6 years. That is not a man who ignored his aunt. That is a man who fought for her the only way his world allowed, quietly, politically, through the machinery of the church rather than the shock of an army. His ambassador in London, Eustace Chapuis, was Catherine's fiercest defender at the English court. His letters to Charles survive. They are extraordinary documents. He wrote about her dignity in the face of daily humiliation, her absolute refusal to accept the title of Princess Dowager, her insistence to her last breath on calling herself Queen of England. Charles read every letter, but here is something that almost never gets said. Catherine never asked him to invade. She was not fighting for rescue, she was fighting for legitimacy. She wanted the Pope to rule in her favor. She wanted her marriage declared valid. She wanted Mary declared legitimate. An army crossing the Channel would not have given her any of that. It would have given her a conquered country, a captive husband, and a throne built on resentment. She wanted the law. Charles was holding the law in place until Henry decided he didn't need the law anymore.
Chapter 4. Henry walks away, and Charles's weapon disappears. In 1533, Henry VIII did something no English monarch had ever done. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England. He had Archbishop Cranmer grant the annulment Rome had refused. He married Anne Boleyn in secret, and he stripped Catherine of her title, replacing Queen of England with the deliberately cruel designation of Princess Dowager, as if her entire marriage had been nothing but a long widowhood of a man she barely knew.
Charles's strongest weapon, the Pope, no longer mattered in England. Henry had stripped it of all power. So why didn't Charles just invade? Because an invasion wasn't simple. It wasn't one bold move. It was a massive, risky operation that needed money and perfect timing. A naval crossing of the English Channel against a country with a serious fleet and the home advantage, while Francis I of France, who never missed an opportunity in his life, hit Charles on the continent from the south, while Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Sultan, continued pushing at the eastern borders of the Habsburg world with the largest army in Europe, while the Protestant princes inside Germany, who had been building military alliances for years, watched for any sign of imperial weakness to make their move.
Charles was already fighting on 3 fronts. An invasion of England would open a 4th, across water, against a country that had not attacked him, to restore a woman who had not asked to be restored by force. And even if somehow he won, then what? He garrisons England indefinitely with Spanish soldiers. He places a queen on a throne that half her own people resent. He hands Francis I a decade-long insurgency to fund from a comfortable distance. The risk was colossal. There is one more thing, one that rarely gets mentioned. By 1535, Catherine was dying, not as a metaphor, physically, genuinely dying. Isolated at Kimbolton Castle, her household stripped down to almost nothing, her health collapsing. Chaput's letters to Charles made this plain. Even the fastest possible military campaign, months of preparation, a channel crossing, a land campaign, would have arrived to find an empty room. She died on the 7th of January, 1536. With her death, the fear that had haunted Charles for nearly a decade vanished. The historian Garrett Mattingly, whose biography of Catherine of Aragon remains one of the most authoritative accounts ever written, recorded what Charles said when the news reached him. He said, "God be praised, now there will be no war." Nothing about her dignity, nothing about her suffering, nothing about the 20 years she gave to a country that took everything from her. Only relief. Just the war he no longer had to fight. The tension, the pressure, the letters, the burden of duty, and Catherine herself still calling herself queen, all of it lifted in a single moment. The shadow of England, relentless, looming, unavoidable, was gone. She had been queen, she had been family, she had been the last living connection to his mother's blood on English soil, and in the end, she became a problem that had solved itself.
Chapter 5. The Pattern He Never Escaped. But here is what makes Charles V more than just a political calculation in a crown. He had made this kind of choice before, long before Catherine, long before England. The pattern did not begin with his aunt, it began with his mother. Juana of Castile, the woman who had refused to sign the Comunero documents, who had chosen her son over her freedom, spent 39 years locked in the castle of Tordesillas. 39 years. From 1509 until her death in 1555. Charles confirmed her confinement when he arrived in Spain. He wore her crown, he signed documents in her name, and he kept her behind those walls until she died. Was it cruelty? He visited her, he corresponded with her. By most accounts, he genuinely believed her confinement was necessary, that Juana's instability made her a danger to herself and a tool in the hands of anyone who wanted to use her as a rival claimant to the throne. But the pattern is there. The most powerful man in Europe, the women in his family who needed him, and the calculation, always the same calculation, that the stability of the empire came first. His mother, his aunt, the same choice made twice. Isabella of Portugal, the woman Charles had married for dowry and to please his people, died in 1539. She was 35. The child she carried was stillborn. Isabella had been perhaps the only woman in his life to whom he was truly faithful. He had loved her, fiercely and without pretense. For their entire marriage, he remained devoted, extraordinary for a king of his time. When she died, Charles walked with her funeral cortege for 2 days and then could not bring himself to attend the burial. He retreated to a monastery in Toledo. 2 months, almost no visitors. His courtiers wrote of uncontrollable weeping behind closed doors. When he finally came out, he wore only black for the rest of his life. And his body was betraying him too. The gout, not the mild inconvenience we sometimes imagine, but an agonizing inflammatory assault on his joints so severe that during the worst attacks he could not bear the weight of a bedsheet on his hands. His fingers swelled and twisted until he often could not hold a pen. The man whose signature commanded the world sometimes had to use a stamp.
He was carried at the head of his armies on a litter. His body failed him. He was in constant pain, still giving orders, still fighting. Chapter 6. The weight he finally put down. The year was 1552. Midnight. A blizzard raged over the Brenner Pass. The 52-year-old emperor, crippled by gout, was carried through the snow on a litter by his attendants. He was fleeing the advancing forces of his own vassal, Maurice of Saxony, a man Charles had trusted, a man who had fought alongside him at Mühlberg. Maurice moved so fast that Charles had no choice but to run, like a fugitive, in the dark. That night broke something no battle ever had. In 1555, Charles signed the Peace of Augsburg. It formally accepted that the Protestant princes could choose the religion of their own territories, the thing he had spent 30 years and rivers of blood fighting to prevent, a permanently divided Christendom. He wrote into law with his own seal. Then he gave everything away. In a ceremony that left witnesses shaken, Charles stood in the Great Hall in Brussels, the same hall where he had been declared of age as a 15-year-old boy, and leaned on the shoulder of a young nobleman named William of Orange because his legs would no longer hold him properly, and wept as he spoke. He listed his journeys: 9 times to Germany, 6 times to Spain, 7 times to Italy, 4 to France, 2 to England, 2 to Africa. He said he did not regret what he had done, but he regretted he had not done it better. He gave the Netherlands, Spain, and the Americas to his son, Philip II of Spain. The imperial crown passed to his brother, Ferdinand I, Holy Roman Emperor. He kept nothing. He retired to a small villa beside the monastery of Uste in a quiet valley in Extremadura, Spain. He filled his rooms with clocks, dozens of them, of every size and mechanism. He spent hours with his clockmaker, trying to make them all strike at precisely the same moment. He never managed it. He died on the 21st of September, 1558, holding the wooden crucifix his wife Isabella had held on her deathbed 19 years before. The woman he had married for a dowry and loved beyond reason, the woman whose funeral he could not bring himself to attend, the woman for whom he had worn black every single day since her death. He had given away 30 nations. He had kept one thing. So here's the real question. Did Charles V fail Catherine of Aragon? He used the most powerful weapon he had, papal authority, and held it for 6 years on her behalf. He placed her most loyal defender at the English court. He refused to recognize Anne Boleyn. He refused to accept Mary's illegitimacy. He fought for Catherine in every diplomatic channel his empire gave him access to. What he did not do was invade England, and the reasons were not indifference. They were geography, money, timing, and the brutal arithmetic of an empire already bleeding on 3 fronts. But here is the harder truth, the one the politics cannot quite cover. This was not the first time Charles made this choice. His mother sat in a tower for 39 years while he wore her crown. Catherine spent her final years stripped of her title, separated from her daughter, dying in a cold castle while he managed the situation from across the water. The most powerful man in the world, and the women in his family who needed him, not armies, not invasions, just him, consistently came second to the demands of empire. Catherine's final letter was not written to Charles. It was written to Henry. She called him her lord and her husband. She forgave him. She asked him to care for their daughter. She did not ask Charles why he had not come. Maybe she already knew. Maybe after a lifetime of watching men choose power over people, she had made her peace with it. Or maybe,
and this is the thought that stays with you. She understood that Charles was not free either, that the man who commanded 30 nations was himself commanded by all of them, that the emperor was just another person trapped by forces larger than himself, wearing a crown instead of chains, but trapped all the same. He chose empire over family, twice. And in the end, empire gave him nothing back but a quiet room, a wooden crucifix, and clocks that would not obey him. If you've made it this far, I can't thank you enough. Please take a second to like the video. It really helps more people find this channel. If you're new here, subscribe and share this with someone who loves the human side of history. Now, I want to ask you something, and I always read your answers. Did Charles V truly do everything he could for Catherine, or did he hide behind politics to avoid a war he never wanted to fight? Leave your thoughts below. And if you want to see another story of power, family, and impossible choices, check out this video next. Thanks again for staying with me till the end. I truly appreciate it. I'll see you in the next one.